Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's really nice to see so many of you here in this room and also online. Today we have another talk in the lecture series organized by the Research Center Transformation of Political Violence. This year organized by the Center for Conflict Studies, specifically by Mariel, Reiss and myself. Very sadly, Mariel Reiss is sick today, so she cannot be here. I say this on the one hand because Mariel was the one who had the idea to invite our speaker today, and she's very sad she can't make it. But hi, Mariel, she will be there online. I also say this because COVID is really back. So I urge everybody, please wear your masks inside. The speaker doesn't have to wear the mask, otherwise it gets too exhausting. Also, it's easier for the audience to understand if there's no mask, but everybody else, please wear your mask throughout the whole lecture. And if you have a question afterwards, of course, you can take it off to ask your questions. Otherwise, please wear it. Yes, but getting to the content of this afternoon, we're extremely pleased to welcome Zethu Matebeni today. Today she came from Bochum, but she is from South Africa, so a long way, and prominent guest. We're really proud to attract such amazing talent every week. Zethu is a sociologist, activist, writer, documentary filmmaker, and professor and South Africa Research Chair in Sexualities, Gender and Queer Studies at the University of Fort Hare. She has also held positions at the University of Western Cape and at the University of Cape Town. Her published doctoral thesis is entitled Black Lesbian Sexualities and Identity in South Africa. She has also edited and curated several other books, amongst them Queer in Africa, LGBTQI Identity, Citizenship and Activism, 2018 with Routledge, and a curated book, Reclaiming African Queer Perspectives on Sexual and Gender Identities. Interestingly, Zethu has also been involved in several kinds of activism, LGBTQ+ activism, since the early 1990s. She's part of Free Gender, a Black lesbian organization in Cape Town, and also was part of Roads Must Fall. So there's really a lot going on. And I think Zethu is in a brilliant position to tell us about the topic of today. Regarding our lecture series, Perspectives on Political Violence, the talk is entitled Queering Perspectives on Violence, and we're all very, very much looking forward to hear what you have to say. Welcome to Marburg. We're really happy to have you.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much, Felix, for that introduction. And thank you to you and Mariel for the invitation to be here. And Mariel, next time. I hope you feel well soon. So it's great to be in conversation with you today. And I call this a conversation because some of the thoughts that I'm presenting, I'm also working through them myself. In her new book, Black and Female, Tsitsi Dagaremba states, I quote, "The first wound for all of us who are classified as Black is empire. The wounds of empire to my part of the world, Southern Africa, are peculiar because they came clothed as gifts. The gifts of the Northwestern Empire to Africa were some of the most violent gifts the world has known." Close quote. This will not be an easy seminar. Living in South Africa as a woman, a Black queer person, is triggering. We dodge violence every day. Some even say we are lucky to be alive. Many women can never say for certain that they will never be raped in their lifetime. To be Black, transgender, lesbian, gay, or queer in Africa is to sign up for violence. Living is a strategy. Some of us have devised strategies for surviving the eventuality of rape, or have calculated the chances of a brutal murder, myself included. So I accept the topic is melancholic. Violence has that effect. Perhaps if approached differently, the results may be less gloomy. So today I would like us to ponder on these two related and difficult questions. Who gets to die? Under what conditions? And what does justice look like for such deaths? South African poet Koleka Phuthuma brutally puts it in her poem, Memoirs of a Slave and a Queer Person. And this is what she says. I don't want to die with my hands up or legs open. This is the state of many queer people in South Africa. It is the state of many Black people across the anti-Black world. A few months ago, Mohamed Lamed Ramez's life was senselessly ended by Dortmund police here in Germany. This is the state of our being. Our hands remain up, unarmed, and yet we are killed, sometimes choked to death, when we already cannot breathe. We continue to survive anti-Blackness, misogyny, transphobia, queerphobia, and are witness to deadly police killings of Black people with impunity. Today, I offer this seminar in memory of Zoliswa Ngonyane, Sizakele Sigasa, Salome Masowa, Yudi Simelane, Thokozane Kwabe, Mado Mafubetu, David Olin, Noxolo Nogwaza, Numisa Mzamela, Nokuthula Khatebe, Nontsikelelo Tyatyeka, Khanyiswa Hani, Henrietta Tapelo Morifi, Sana Super, Nobile Khumalo, Phumeza Nkolonzi, Leslie Makosua, Nonki Smaus, Lerato Moloi, Duduzile Zozo, Gift Disebo Makau, Andile Blessing Zondi, Sasanda Gumede, Nathaniel Spohane Bele, Kulekani Gomazi, Andile Lulu Ntutela, Lonwabo Jack, Lucky Kleinbo Mochabi, Pelokazi Mqathana, Lindokuhle Mabo, Aubrey Boshoga, Masixole Level, Anele Bengu, Lulama Vandaba, Sam Junior Mbata, Motse Mweketsi, Sheila Lebelo, Portia Nzweni, Tapelo Sehata, Narempela, Lindokuhle Cele, Liabona Mabishi, Spamandla Khoza, Kirvan Fortin, Bonang Khalei, Shanice Jonathan, Nonhlanhla Kunene. These are the names of Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people who have come to know death and its many faces. People who knew them, people who have never been found, brutally and excessively murdered them. Many of these deaths are unresolved, unaccounted for, with no arrests made. Death isn't the fabric of queer existence. It can even be said in some parts of the African continent, to be queer or lesbian, transgender or gay is to call upon death itself. We have met death in all its forms: social, psychological, emotional, cultural, and ultimately physical death. North American scholar Heather Love echoes this and asserts, I quote, "Those who are directly identified with same-sex desire most often end up dead. If they manage to survive, it is on such compromised terms that it makes death seem attractive." Close quote. I read Heather Love alongside Indian feminist human rights lawyer Indira Jaisingh, who states, "To get justice, you have to die. That is the scenario." How do queer people reconcile the possibility of death as an everyday reality and the attainment of justice in death? What is justice when the one in death has died? Queer people face the death penalty in Mauritania, South Sudan, northern Nigeria, and southern Somalia. They also are considered illegal and cannot exist in 30 countries in Africa: Algeria, Burundi, Comoros, Egypt, Ethiopia, Gambia, Guinea, Liberia, Libya, Malawi. I can name all of them. Homophobia makes no distinction on the basis of identities. All people presumed homosexual and thus against society's natural heterosexual order become homophobia's victims. So while lesbians and gays are the primary recipients of this form of hatred and violence, bisexual and transgender people have been quickly lined up. So LGBT persons in Africa, because of colonial legacies and laws governing against the order of nature, whatever that was called, are familiar with the state of non-existence and constant denial, a denial of citizenship and a rejection of being. It is because of this context that I ponder on the question, who gets to die, under what conditions? And what does justice look like for such deaths? And here I must make clear, I am not centralizing queer people's deaths. Rather, I use them as a starting point to think about the kinds of violence and deaths that many Black women and many LGBTIQ persons face every day in South Africa and in Africa specifically. So let me first unpack my use of the term queer, which here is not untroubled. On the one hand, it is deployed as a short code for all non-normative. I question this notion of the norm, but anyway, we can talk about that later. For all non-normative sexual and gender expressions relating to LGBTI people, the risk, of course, is what sounds like interchanging categories, replacing one with the other. This is deliberate, particularly because of queer theory's lack and at the same time its possibilities to unsettle identity categories. On the other, it is a notion that should be necessarily examined in the African context, specifically in relation to Black bodies and an analysis of violence. And so I draw from Nyek's latest work that positions queerness as simply meaning, and I quote from Nyek, out of order. Something that if previously it existed, it is no longer recognized or needed as such. It has ceased to be in line with expected dominant conventions regarding matters of taste and representation. It is something that gives itself to nothing, things or no things, things that object to captivity pressed upon them by accident or design, or inadvertently self-imposed. So queer has often been viewed mainly through or by this one-dimensional focus of sex as its marker. And of course, we can go a long way in terms of critiquing that. Race, class, gender, nationality, location, and other markers are similarly important, but often disappear in queer analysis. To understand the violence towards Black, lesbian, gay, and transgender bodies only as queer, or reading the desire and the sex subjects, is an injustice to their lives. On a daily basis, Black women, Black lesbians, and trans women and other non-normative bodies endure everyday forms of systemic violence, marginalization, and oppression. They endure this as people living in indecent spaces and conditions of poverty, high unemployment, crime, limited access to services, and adequate care, and a non-responsive criminal justice system. So to think about queerness in the frame in which I'm expanding it, that means to include race, sexuality, and gender, class, nationality in the minimal form, we have to consider how these categories are constructed and experienced in the service of power politics. And that's also part of systemic violence. So thinking about queerness in this form allows for possibilities to revive and reconnect to other movements of liberation. And I draw that from Kathy Cohen. And also to challenge the current normalizing position of queer politics in South Africa. So what does it mean to do violence to a queer body? I started off by reading names of queer people whose stories I have been following for a while now. They were all brutally murdered in South Africa. Their ages range from 14 years to 45 years. For women, these brutal murders added to the disturbing popularized notion of corrective and curative rapes targeted towards Black lesbians. As all women in South Africa, Black lesbians are similarly vulnerable to sexual violence. At the same time, they occupy a different space in society as challenging, often openly rejecting both sexual, gender, and other cultural norms. While sexual violence towards women generally is aimed at abusing power over women and female bodies, we also understand that the added vulnerability of rejecting heteronormativity and the binary logic carries a heavy and often deadly penalty on Black female bodies. So feminist scholar Phumla Dinawaqola is correct to observe that Black lesbians in South Africa are highly visible manifestations of the undesirable. This undesirability renders them easily disposable in the heteropatriarchal order. This has been evident in a number of instances. In the public stoning of 19-year-old Zoliswa Nkonyane by her peers very close to her home. And how one judge in the court case of Yudi Simelane attested that her sexuality was not a motivator for her being murdered. And in the excessive brutalization of their bodies, a practice which I suggest as pushing the body beyond death. Perpetrators plan new victories over Black queer bodies. One gunshot is never enough. A knife must pierce through a body more than 3 times. Strangling must be accompanied by insertion of a foreign object. Rape is no longer deadly. After the first shot to the head, the third stab to the heart, the choking after the rape, what else is being killed? What more is there to die when death has already occurred? These are questions I grapple with as I think about queer deaths, all these deaths that I've been following for years. Eric Stanley offers the concept of overkill, excessive violence that pushes a body beyond death. In relation to the queer body, Stanley argues, it is not just the desire to simply end a specific life, but the ending of all queer life. This concept may be useful in helping us understand the excessive brutalization of the body. In her thesis, Megan Armstrong argues that overkill is a communicative form of violence. There are 2 conditions under which overkill is made possible: the weaponization and the brutalization of the body, and the gendering and sexualizing of the other. Both these conditions of possibility have a connection to abjection, that is, creating a category that is outside our culture. Sexualizing and gendering the body relies upon a pre-existing understanding of the feminine as subordinate to the masculine. where sexualized bodies become public space for humiliation. In this sense, the excessive brutalization or overkill of a body marks the victim as abject, stripped of its humanizing possibilities. Abjection, and I quote here at length from Armstrong, abjection therefore covers a variety of processes that occur in overkill. It defines how the other is perceived and produced, as well as the violence that is done to the other. This abject violence further constitutes the other as abject. It finds resonance in our understanding of the abject as something that does not belong to our subjectivity and is therefore frightening, but at the same time, the abject repulses us. It also attracts us. There's a dual operation of fear and fascination that ensures our attention remains fixed on the object, on the abject. Abject violence in overkill, specifically in the brutalization of the body, is an attempt to do more than kill or harm the other, but is a means of conferring utter dominance, complete humiliation with or without the death of the other. Close quote. So overkill requires an effective response in order to be effective. It needs to be felt by those being harmed, that is the community of the victims, to illustrate their complete dehumanization and powerlessness, while also being felt by perpetrator community so that the abjection and dehumanization of the victim and victim's community reconstitute the subjectivity of the perpetrator's community as dominant and superior. I'm sure we have all observed this many times when, well, probably not in your context, but in my context, when a Black woman is raped and murdered, or how the rape and murder of Black, lesbian, and transgender persons or feminine presenting gay men is justified in society. And there are many of those kinds of justifications that we come across within the African context. So abjection then, through overkill as Armstrong asserts, is a means of separating the human from the non-human. So similarly, Eric Stanley arrives at this notion of the human through Achille Mbembe's provocative question. But what does it mean to do violence to what is nothing? Of course, there's a conceptual leap here, moving from non-human to nothing. So what is a queer body in Africa? So the queer body in South Africa and in 4 other countries who have decriminalized same-sex sexualities or broadly queer existence becomes human only through its attainment of rights. Thus, it attains life under the domain of rights and recognition as being part of the body politic. But what does this really mean? So Tsitsi Dagaremba again asserts that the effect of both colonization and human rights discourses is similar. Both make Black people recipients of an imperial discourse that categorizes us as wanting and thus requiring punishment and disparagement. Close quote. So I ask, are queers really human? In other parts of the continent, of the African continent, the queer body is not yet human. It exists under the conditions of impossibility, what can be deemed as the zones of nothing. Notions that the queer body is less than animals or non-humans has rendered the queer body into nothing. So many presidents in African countries have said this, including former president of Zimbabwe, Namibia, the Gambia, etc. They've all made these violent assertions. But to theorize queer bodies as nothing is a challenging task to grapple with, particularly for me. But following Mbembe, let me try and take this on. Following Mbembe, Stanley suggests a deep connection between the human and nothing, arguing that the former makes the latter not only possible, but necessary. If this logic is followed, then the work of death, of the death that is already nothing, not quite human, binds the categorical misrecognition of humanity. The human, then, resides in the space of life and under the domains of rights, whereas the queer inhabits the place of compromised personhood and the zone of death. Rather than conceiving the queer subject as nothing, as Eric Steinle suggests, it is Walter Mignolo's conceptualization of the human that connects the queer subject to decolonial thinking and living that I find illuminating. Mignolo's frameworks challenges not to assimilate, but to deny the universal pretense of the humanitas. Mignolo disrupts this binary logic of human and nothing and extends this framework by referring to Sylvia Wynter's analysis, pointing out that the crisis of the human is that there are, and I quote, all those who are not fully incorporated in the Western construction of man, human, capital M, capital H. That is all the we who do not identify as human, capital H, because we have been placed outside of it. The work that lies ahead then, to extrapolate from Mignolo, is to critique and deny the impulse to universalize and categorize the notion of human. What if we start from the practice, from the premise, we are all non-human? They will never kill us all. Democracy presents us with the power to choose and to create our own narrative about how we become who we are. While we cannot ignore or forget the past that is deeply influenced by memory of violence, by the memory of violence, colonization, apartheid, and victimhood, particularly among Black South Africans, there are possibilities of moving from this to a present that fashions varied narratives of being. For many Black queer people who have been pursuing recognition, legitimacy, inclusion, and acceptance in the face of rejection and violence, creating a new narrative may be an important project to undertake. Although it seems easy to be enticed by the idea of death, we have to resist being comfortable with this notion, resist the death impulse and all that kills the heart and spirit through political and spiritualized violence or otherwise, as Nyeka says. Death, I suggest, is not the only attractive option or possibility. We can create alternatives, what Nyeka calls ethical attitudes. Bell Hooks offered love as an alternative. She challenges us to find the paths that will make us live fully, without fear, and when the time comes, die well. This notion of dying well is an important one and requires further interrogation and practice for Black people in particular, and for Black queer people. If we know that death is part of living, then how do we live fully and die well? So in September 2013, at the People's Pride March in Johannesburg, Black queers presented what I read as not only the possibility of death, but life as an opportunity. A powerful visual display by Black, lesbian, transgender, intersex media and advocacy organization, Eranti, took all Pride marchers, I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar with Pride, right? All Pride marchers through a walk down what they called a hate crimes lane. This was a different march against hate crimes. Marchers were asked to walk slowly and silently. Volunteers from this organization held 30 placards with the names and details of murdered LGBT persons, some of whom I have read at the beginning. As each marcher walked past a name, they had to remember each victim's life. At the end of this lane, a white banner with the words, "They will never kill us all," flew above the marchers. This was a significant moment for many people who had imagined violent death as the only option for queer people. This banner was adopted from anti-apartheid protesters in Udenake in Langa, who had gathered on March 21, 1985, at the 25th commemoration of the Sharpeville massacre. On that day, the police gunned down 35 people for attending a funeral. At the People's Pride March in 2013, this reminder, "They will never kill us all," echoed that even in the possibility of death, life exists, or that we will not all be killed. This march culminated in an emotional realization that death also has its limits, and that queer people can walk proudly as defiant people who claim that choice of sexual orientation, gender identity, choice of work, choice of identities can never be in our world a basis for discrimination. It was a powerful moment that signified that even death could be resisted. And in this resistance, I suggest a pushing back that signals a refusal to remain unaffected or maintain the status quo. Elsewhere, I have argued that resistance can be painful, but it's the work that queer people need to do. It is a kind of resistance that refuses to be negated. It is laborious, steadfast in its position, and takes many risks while making many demands. Resistant resilience refuses to be silenced, erased, invisibilized, and made to die. Returning to the 47 Black, gay, queer, and transgender youth whose names I read earlier, I posit that they become a central part of the queer movement that challenges all forms of conditions that maintain Black queer vulnerabilities. In expanding the zones of queerness, I am calling for the possibility to see the violence towards the 47 murdered as violence towards Black life, towards the marginalized along race, class, gender, and location. It is to recognize that patriarchy, heteronormativity, homonormativity, like homophobia and transphobia, similarly contribute to the death of Black queer lives. That to attain justice for the 47 and other murdered queer people should not rely solely on the criminal justice system, which continues to fail us, but should be part of transforming our spaces and environments to decent and livable spaces, to ensuring that Black queer lives matter before they are dead, that justice should be an everyday reality for the living and not the domain of the dead. And I will end again with Koleka Putuma's poem on Black solidarity, which ends in this poignant manner. Stop making our bodies a cemetery. I did not come here to die or to be a sacrifice for you.
I was so struck I forgot to get up. Thank you very much for this very powerful talk. We have enough time for a conversation, and this is what you also announced you would like to have. So let's have a conversation about this.
Yeah.
Are there immediate questions, reactions, comments from the audience? Yes. Yeah, please remember to speak into the mic, even though it feels weird, because this is only for online, right?
All right, I will try my very best. Yeah, it does feel weird, indeed. Thank you so much for this really important talk and for bringing this really important topic here. It really touched me, I have to say, also on a personal level, since I have quite a lot of queer friends in South Africa. So thanks for raising our attention to this. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a bit more on also the historical dimension of the violence that queer people in South Africa are experiencing, and how this is maybe also rooted in and linked to a broader history of violence in South Africa and apartheid more specifically. And then also because you were also talking about resistance and you were mentioning this example of this march, how maybe it's also the resistance of queer people in South Africa linked to or rooted in resistance and practices, resistant practices, which were already used during apartheid. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I respond now?
Wish.
Okay.
I think we have enough time, so you can also just go ahead and
Okay.
answer.
Yeah, great. Thank you for your questions. So I think it's easy to start thinking about the link of violence and place it only with apartheid. I started reading a text from Zethu Matebeni, who just puts it so beautifully and says, our first wound is with colonization. It starts with empire. And we see this because a lot of how we understand violence is through the colonial encounter. What happens what happens at the site at empire, when empire comes and takes over, was a violent conquest. And I make this in somewhere else where I give a talk on UDC Melane, where I talk about how colonization, basically, because it took over, everything, it took over the land, it made us see that violence is normal. It normalized that kind of violence. It normalized, the taking and the stealing. I mean, colonizers stole land. They raped women. So we can trace these kinds of acts and this violence from that colonial encounter. And so, even though we talk a lot about, post-apartheid South Africa as a violent country or a violent moment, actually the violence has always been there. South Africa arises out of violence. And unless we understand that and try to deal with what empire represents, we probably won't be able to deal with the violence. Because one of the things that happens at the moment is that the interpretation or the understanding of violence to say, oh, South Africa is a culture of violence and Black men are raping Black women, Black men are killing Black men. It's like, who has been killing Black people? Who came and made 30 million people disappear in Africa? And that question is important, because until we deal with that, we're doing superficial analysis of really trying to understand how violence happens today. And, again, unfortunately, I mean, I'm partly involved in gender studies, not partly fully, but some of our analysis also just talks about the gendered nature of violence and removes all these other things that happen, the structural violence, systemic violence, etc., to only see violence as, men attacking women. But actually, I mean, nations have been attacked. And what does it mean to attack land, and take that land, take over the land and dispossess people? And where do you think those people are supposed to belong and find a sense of being? So these things are all kind of connected. And I think we need to have a thorough analysis of, how do we unpack the violence that's happening today and link it to really what happened. So that's my response on the first question. The second one is also on resistance. And again, unfortunately, I think now people are starting to rewrite history or histories, because even some of the resistance movements, we're only thinking of them from a moment of, resisting apartheid. So we can say that, Black South Africans have always been resisting through the various moments of solidarity across the globe, etc. But actually, there's been this resistance has always been part of, trying to figure out how do we ensure that we're not all killed, right? We're not all removed from our lands. And this is I mean, there are many people now who are actually doing this kind of work to say how is it that Africans have resisted over, over these centuries of very painful domination. And also, how do you think about resistance from not only from a colonial perspective, but resistance from those people for whom resistance is freedom? How do you, turn the gaze and not think of resistance always resisting because, something is being taken from you, etc., but to resist because this notion is where freedom lies. And how then do we read that resistance as not a reactionary act, but a life-giving act? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your powerful talk and also for reading out some names of those who were killed. I think this was really moving. I would like two thoughts.
Okay.
First, I was thinking about debates among Colombian feminists, and there are some Afro-Colombian feminists who reject the notion of intersectionality. And for example, Betty Lozana is one of them, and she always says, soy una mujer negra, and this means I am a black woman, and she writes it as one word to show that there is this deeper connection between the two categories, and I thought this is quite interesting. And the other thought, before your talk, we were joking about the high suicide rates among students at Bochum University. And then I was thinking about suicidal behavior among youth, especially among queer youth, because I think on one hand, you talked about resistance and rejecting the notion of death and resilience and resistance, but I think there are so many young people who just do not make it to a later age. So I think this is also an important aspect if we talk about a panorama of violence.
Yeah, you're right. And thank you for raising those points. Yeah, I mean, I know even in South Africa, we are really struggling with understanding suicide suicide amongst young people, or suicide generally. And also because some of the ways in which we understand it is only through a very particular kind of, framework. And I mean, there's other things I want to say, but I think it would be a little bit possibly too controversial, given that this is an online thing. But but I think we perhaps we may have an opportunity to really understand, even though I am moving or trying to shift away from this death impulse, but there could be something else that we're missing in really interrogating death. But yeah, I don't want to go into detail with that because it could land very wrongly. So I'll keep it at that. But I thank you for raising that issue around suicide. So I like this idea that you're presenting on a critique. Well, maybe it's a critique of intersectionality. So people always asked us in South Africa, why do you always call yourselves Black lesbian women? It's like, isn't it obvious? It's like, if society knew it, we wouldn't have to say it. And so it goes again with this idea that you're drawing from South American or Colombian feminists. But just in terms of intersectionality itself, I find the concept very difficult in my context, and I've been talking about that a lot. I gave a talk on intersectionality and trying to think about intersectionality, the concept through an African perspective. Firstly, it does not even translate into some of the African languages. And not only does it not translate, but it does not give meaning to the realities of those particular contexts. So some of the work that we've been doing was to think about how else can we think, if we want to use this idea of intersectionality, how could we collectively create it to give meaning to our own realities? And so one concept that developed out of this notion of thinking, or this idea of rethinking intersectionality, is ukuhlangana kobuntu, which draws from African philosophies of Ubuntu, but also ukuhlangana, which is a collectivity and coming together, finding solutions together. So how does trying to be human together and finding solutions to better our environment work as an intersectional, or what we want to call intersectional framework? Yeah, so I thank you.
Hi, thanks very much also from me for a very impressive and thought-provoking presentation. My name is Susanne Sister from the Center for Conflict Studies. I think I'm asking a question for Mariel Reiss.
Okay.
I don't know if she's waiting for her to send one, but I think I can come up with one she would have asked.
Okay.
With us. You very convincingly draw a line between violence and colonialism through Zethu Matebeni and other kind of paths and tendencies. But this is about violence, and I wonder how kind of homophobia is rooted in the imperial, in colonialism, how kind of gender categories were invented and constructed through colonialism in order to lead to violence against homosexuals and queer people. So I'm not so interested, I'd like to say Mariel, sorry, this is not the case, not so interested in the notion of violence, but in the construction of the actual categories of men, women, and kind of the idea that love has to be heterosexual.
Okay, very nice question. But I'm sure Mariel would have read Mariel Lugones, who unpacks this quite well. So I'm not even going to do justice to Mariel Lugones. You can read it on the coloniality of gender. Yeah. But also, I mean, there are many other scholars who have done this work. Sylvia Tamale puts it, the Ugandan scholar who puts it out there that homophobia is not an African thing. It comes with, particularly with, with the laws that arrive in places that have been colonized. And we know these laws, all of them have created this category of persons against the order of nature. Yeah, and what was that project? To create persons against the order of nature. It was based on the framework of what it means to be a person. And that was a white man. Yeah, so everything else that did what the white man was not doing was considered against the order of nature. So if a white man conceived of himself as, a heterosexual being, in places where same-sex activity was seen, and now we have a lot of this evidence. Mark Epracht and Ian Edwards just published a book on homosexuality based on archives that actually have never been released in mines, the starting of the mines in South Africa, and in these colonial prisons, and how same-sex activity was legislated against when it was a norm. Yeah, and we've seen this in many other works across the continent, where, now we know, Ifemat Yume has written about this. Now we know that these categories have always existed and people have always expressed themselves in very different ways. But this impulse to create people into a particular kind of norm is the violence that has made us now illegal beings, un-African. It's not Africans who considered us un-African. It was the colonialists who said, oh, but this can't be part of who you are. So that extension of, this categorization and violence harms to affect my life now as a queer person. So how do I become an entity that is illegal in my own land? Yeah. When I know I can draw from histories of people like me who have existed and who've thrived, who've lived lives, who've conquered. But now in 1990 something, I have to be considered abnormal or unnatural. And of course, we have not changed these laws. Many African countries, the good ones, the good thing is that some of the Lusophone speaking countries have been changing their laws. South Africa still uses these laws, even with the most progressive constitution. We still have these laws from the Dutch and the British, etc. And these are the things that we have to undo so that we can become, I suppose, better beings at some point. Yeah.
Very much. My question is, would you say that the dynamics of violence against Black queer bodies changes in situations of armed conflict? And if so, how? Is it the same old thing just amplified, or are there sort of additional layers that make queer people more or less vulnerable in these situations?
What do you mean by armed conflict?
Specifically war, I would say.
Okay, because I'm asking this because in South Africa, feminists believe that we are at war. Black women are at war because we are violated every day. And what are these arms? There's a conflict every day. These arms are knives, they're guns, they're bottles, they're things, the toilet brushes, everything is being used on us. So that's why I'm asking, what do you consider armed conflict?
I guess I'm getting at a situation where sort of state control and the state monopoly on violence has been dissolved, and so it's a more anarchic situation, maybe, in comparison to, violence still occurs, but it's a situation where there's a very strong grasp on power of a specific government, for example.
Okay. I don't know. I have to think about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much also for me. When you were talking about the overkill, I thought also in the femicides in Mexico, where the bodies of women are also brutalized, and the media there also makes a re-victimization of these bodies. So I was wondering, how is the media coverage in South Africa about the death of the murder of queer Black people?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that. There used to be, so when the first case that was reported by the media of a Black queer person was it was UDC Melane. It was Sizakela Sigasa, Salome Masowa, and UDC Melane. So those happened around the same time. And the headline was a Black lesbian dead, a Black lesbian killed. And then The following month, another Black lesbian killed. The following month, another Black lesbian killed. Yeah, no names. And it kept going like this. And as activists, we had to interrupt this kind of narrative. And we did that by engaging with the media, writing back to say, you know, because one of the things that they were very interested, what the media was interested in was, you know, signaling out this idea of corrective rape, that these are Black lesbians and they are victims, and they are victims of corrective rape, right? And they're victims of corrective because they're trying to be men. Yeah. And also because they come from townships, they are Black, they are poor. And so on the many layers, we had to keep interrupting this kind of narrative, doing sensitization workshops with the media, calling journalists to come understand, you know, how do we use these kinds of terms? Some of them didn't even know, you know, the difference between a lesbian person and a gay person, a transgender. And I say that sometimes you laugh, but actually most people don't know. You ask them, what is LGBT? What does it stand for? And they don't know. Yeah, but they're so happy to have a comment or make a statement. So a lot of work went into actually, you know, engaging with the media and writing, even writing like little pamphlets on how to report on violence towards queer people, but also not just engaging the media, engaging the judiciary. We did a lot of work engaging court officials, judges, because they also didn't know, they didn't have the expertise to see how violence can be targeted towards a person because of who that person is. And this is kind of weird because we live in, you know, in South Africa, you want to assume that people knew that all Black people were targeted during apartheid because they are Black. So you understand that violence can be targeted because of, you know, of your race. But people couldn't translate that violence can also, you know, target your gender identity or your sexual orientation, etc. And so in many of the court cases, and that's why actually most of them, actually none of them, only one person out of all that list that I read you, one person, the perpetrator was really sentenced. And it was also because the judges would say, oh, but this has got nothing to do with sexuality, or it's nothing to do with being a lesbian. It's just because this person is a woman, and a woman is trying to be a man. Oh yeah, but why do they wear pants? Why do they walk at night? Yeah, so these were the kinds of questions that you get when, so trying to interrupt these kinds of narratives and interrupt the ignorance, you know, educate the judiciary, advocate for different kinds of analysis and inclusion within the legal and also within the criminal justice system. Because what would happen is that, you know, you get raped, you go to the police, particularly for women, for lesbian women, and the police will say, but why are you dating a woman? Where's your boyfriend? Yeah. And the media would report this. They would use the same kind of narrative that this person was raped or this person was murdered because, you know, they don't have a boyfriend. It's like, but why? Why should you? So a lot of work needs, like, and it's still ongoing. I mean, Free Gender, the organization that I'm part of, does a lot of work working with the police, with the entire criminal justice system, to actually ensure that when you go to report your case, you're not victimized again. And that when the media comes to get the case that there were so many people who were violated in this area, they're not going to single out particular bodies because of what they look like, or they're going to have a thorough analysis of what is happening in that area. And the police are also able to engage with what exactly is going on? How do we understand this kind of violence in our community? Yeah.
Switch side of the book, so.
Okay.
Oh, thank you for your intervention. And my question is, what is for South Africa the official excuse to harbor all this hatred towards the queer people, LGBT community in general? Because we have religion, which is kind of crumbling now, but what is there? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. It's an interesting question. I mean, I think we're so quick to say hatred, but actually we need to figure out where that hatred comes from, right?
Yeah.
So religion does play a role. Yeah, I mean, particularly Christianity. But that's also being challenged at the moment. Challenged in the sense that it you know, questioning this narrative around, and I think that has also always been going on, but I think even within queer spaces, people are not taking for granted that Christianity will always, you know, put you against ungodliness. But we're seeing a lot of people who are talking about Christianity that is much more inclusive. So I would say, yes, religion, the church in particular, does play a role, but there are also some moments of interrupting that from within. You know, lots of queer Christians are doing that work. And then culture, this thing that we call culture. And I think in South Africa, everything is culture. So by what that means is, so it can be said, we loosely say, oh, okay, my culture as a Black person is to be, you know, is to be a woman. If I'm a woman, therefore I must have a husband and have children. Yeah. And we call that culture. And so this notion of culture plays a big part in ensuring that people kind of like remain, like, so that you are not considered an African, you have to fall within the cultural norms. But it could be anything. Culture could be anything. Men who are considered effeminate, it's against culture. Not going to church, it's against culture. You know, that's what I'm saying. Culture is all encompassing sometimes, or most cases actually. And yeah, but that's also being challenged. But that is the most difficult one actually to challenge, because when you get into that space, we have to engage, or we have to interrogate why we believe that if this is our culture, why does it not change when we know that culture changes? Yeah, so why does culture not allow for certain things to exist when culture changes over time? Yeah, we understand that, but we resist allowing culture to allow for multiple existences. Yeah. And with this, we saw a lot when, so South Africa has the Same-Sex or Civil Union Act, which is the act that allows same-sex couples to marry. So when that act was being debated, it was two groups who usually don't speak with the same voice came together against this proposition or this idea of the act. And it was the Christian and the Muslim groups together with the traditional African traditional groups. They came together and opposed the bill, the Civil Union Bill. And they were using the same language, that it is against culture. And culture is premised on the notion of God being a man and God being heterosexual. Yeah. But of course, they didn't win because obviously the Civilian Act was passed. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I think my question will a bit overlap with the religion, because as we know that African countries are one of the most religious, I believe, more than 90% of these identify as a religion. I was wondering, in your presentation, you said about the head of the states or president openly stigmatized and dehumanized the people.
Yeah.
And in this sense, I was wondering, does state, head of the states support these ideas of the church and its stigmatizations of the stigmatizations of the queer people? And does they use this to stay on board to stay in power?
Yeah.
In general, and does this, in the sense that state itself controls the church, or the church has more freedom in the African stigmatized people?
Yeah, very interesting question. This actually could be a very good thesis topic, because you see, in the case of South Africa is a secular state, but I mean, I'll give you an example. So anytime when a president is being sworn in, religion plays a big part of that ceremony. Recently, the king of the Zulu nation in South Africa was being sworn in as the king. And the first encounter, or the first thing that you see, you can check it on YouTube. The first thing that you see is priests coming to get him to sign a document and give him a Bible. Yeah. and this is like the most traditional person he is the king of the Zulu people, the most traditional person you can get. But the first thing that he needs is a Bible. I mean, yeah. So we will say that we live in a secular state, but actually we live in a very religious state, and a particular version of religion. The former president and many presidents in the continent, many of them are attached to some church, especially the charismatic ones. In South Africa, the former president, our former president actually raped a queer woman, and the church came to his rescue and elevated him to, the status of whatever they elevate their status to, maybe the dean or whatever of the church, or the deacon. So there is a very close, and I call it marriage, because it's a very heteronormative thing, very close marriage between the state and religion. And it is one of our biggest challenges. So if you look at, and you see this a lot, if you watch political campaigns before elections, during election, you just look at the kind of narrative. It's all about the church. Where do these campaigns take place? In most cases, it would be in big stadiums, and these pastors are called to revive the people so that they can vote for this new leader of the nation, who becomes then the new God, in a sense. So there is that very strong play of elevating the African man to the status of whatever religious being. But yeah. And of course the church does, that's when, so for example, many people have written about political campaigns in Uganda, right? Particularly Uganda, because Museveni has a very close relationship with the church and uses different church members to to campaign against homosexuality so that he can win. So his motive is basically to say, we are Ugandans if we are against homosexuality, and therefore Christian. Or Christian, we are Christian Ugandans, therefore against homosexuality. Yeah.
Any more questions? Speak directly into the mic.
Thank you also for me, and thank you for this big part of the for the communication, because the other talks were so long that we hadn't had enough time to ask questions. So I'm very pleased for that one.
Thanks.
For that. I have two questions.
Mm.
One is you talked about briefly, and one question was briefly about the let's say colonial heritage about the anti-queerness. And I read from time to time in social media that people believe that focusing on pre-colonial point of views of queerness would be would help African people and communities to overcome this homophobic and anti-queerness in the societies. And I would like to know what you think about that. And the other question is, I don't know about the statistics of the homicides, but do you know anything about differences in the class of the victims? Like, are there working people? Are there richer? Anything? Because I think I know that poverty plays a role sometimes in regarding to homicides, and I don't know if it also plays a role in the statistics or the papers you've read.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I like this question around looking at pre-colonial views. I mean, I think as scholars, we do that, right? But does it really translate to everyday reality? You know, so what? Like I can say, as I'm saying now, I know all this work. Does it keep me safe? No. Am I going, like, if I'm encountering a perpetrator, I'm going to say, hey, wait a minute, you know, I existed in 1600. You know, like, no. So yeah, I mean, I that work is important, but we also have to find ways of making it translate so that people can live. And I think that's the challenge that we are facing. So a lot of people now know that you know, we are interrupting this narrative where people say, but you know, being gay or being queer is un-African, and we say, no, it is. We have evidence. We can give you this evidence. But then there's always a comeback. Oh, but God created Adam and Eve. Oh, okay, now must I now go and, you know, go and find, you know, other forms of religion that existed in Africa, other forms of spirituality that show you that our deities had all these kinds of genders. And is that actually going to really change you from hurting me? We don't know, and probably not. So even though the work is important and it's necessary as a scholarship, but we also need to figure out how do we make it as a public discourse. Not to say, and not a discourse that is just going to be about, no, we don't hurt, don't kill, you know, let's not violate other Africans because we are violating our essence. You know, it shouldn't be about that. It should be about how do we see ourselves? How do we create a new being, a new human in Africa? And one of my challenges also with this is that it already starts from acknowledging this negation, that we've been negated because of colonial, you know, of that colonial encounter. And so now we are kind of like speaking back to it and not necessarily recrafting a different way of speaking. So for example, there was a moment in South Africa particularly where a lot of queer people started, or they were seen as if they were all going the route of becoming indigenous healers. what we call a sangoma. And some people were interpreting this shift as a way in which people are legitimizing their sexuality and gender identity, because in that realm, there's no distinction, because, you exist as a multiple being who has the ancestral spirit of a man, a woman, or whoever, and you have a body that looks in a particular way. So a lot of people were saying, queer people are going towards this path because this is how they're making sense of who they are. And that again was a problem, because it already starts from that notion that, we've been denied, and not seeing this as part of a continuation of Black existence, that any Black being is an indigenous healer, actually, because we come from the land and we've been given the gifts to heal ourselves and heal each other through the land. So I think a lot of these things, even though they're so important, we need to find ways of translating them for public use, and create new discourses, not discourses that are countering what exists, but find new ways of being, find new ways of speaking. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, actually, I also have a question.
Yes.
So this is part of this big project, Transformations of Political Violence.
Yeah.
And we're just getting started. There's a lot of work, conceptual work, also empirical work. And I noticed that you chose the title Queering Perspectives on Violence, with no political in there. Is this a conscious choice, or to put it differently, is there even a non-political violence?
Oh, I didn't put it because it's already there, no? I mean, I think my talk was quite political.
I agree.
Yes. I think I just wanted to centralize particular things, centralize queerness, really, and how to rethink queerness from a particular perspective. And queerness is a political project. And so is violence. So I think it's already there. Yeah. I mean, maybe the next round I can just put a semicolon, a political point. But I get what you're saying. But I think it is, yeah, I mean, yeah, as I'm saying, it's already worked into that. And I'm wondering what work does political do, not as a word, but do in terms of shifting our thinking around violence? Not much?
That's a question.
Yeah, it's a question, but you're saying not much, so why are we using it?
No, I'm posing the question to you.
Okay. I don't think so. I don't. Well, it can be signaled, because I think there's a frame in which you can think about political violence through, what happens in states, wars, etc. That kind of, in terms of engaging political power. But I think there are other forms of politics, the inner workings of power within moments that aren't actually visibilized when you're talking about political violence. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I don't see any other questions. I think this is already a good sort of way of concluding, unless I've missed anyone. Yeah, because I think those people who come here every week, they did notice that our understanding of political is not limited to, interstate war, or these kinds of big questions. But we think that the other questions are also pretty big.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think you gave us an enormously insightful, very I don't know. I'm kind of struck and still kind of lost for words. So it was a really, really impressive talk. And I really would like to thank you. Thanks for coming, for taking the time, preparing such an amazing presentation. I think we all learned quite a bit, and I do hope we can keep the conversation going.
Yeah.
Thank you
I'd
very
like that.
much.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you all. Yeah.